So I first came out to Burma in 1990 as a junior diplomat in the British Embassy, and I learnt Burmese before coming out here. And I stayed here for about 3 years, and then subsequently came back as ambassador in 2002 for a few years. At that point I married a Burmese, which sort of cemented my relationship with the country. And so when this job came up to be director for Myanmar Centre for Responsible Business, I decided to jump for it, and we've moved back here a few months ago. To be here and to speak Burmese is an incredible privilege, and at the time I first came out here it was a pretty closed country. You could stay here for 2 weeks, it was difficult to get a visa, and so I found that gave me a sort of connection to the country which I think I wouldn't have had to any other country in the world, except perhaps North Korea, I'm not sure. Since then, there's been a radical change in terms of the attitude of Western governments to business, and that's what's brought me back here, not in a diplomatic posting, but in a job working to support businesses coming in to help them understand the risks of investing and doing business here, but also, just as importantly, to help Myanmar businesses start to raise their game in terms of international responsible business practice, whether it's respecting human rights or being much stricter on corruption and other issues like that. There's an encouraging return of the diaspora. I think that's a very positive sign. There are plenty of Burmese who've gone off and worked in Europe, in America, in Australia and Singapore, and they've been training as engineers, accountants, and you're starting to see them come back. But there is a definite shortage of qualified people who have worked in open systems, and particularly in the government. I mean, the government bureaucracy is still suffering from having been basically 60 years working in a socialist and a military system, and so empowering middle-ranking civil servants is a real challenge for the current leadership. I think there are plenty of elements of the bureaucracy which haven't been reformed yet, but at the same time there's been a huge number of laws that have been pushed through Parliament to try and modernise, and the challenge is to get the balance right. There's probably been too many new laws drafted with not enough time given for each one, and I think there could be more productive legal drafting if it was open for wider consultation at an earlier time, and that would be an opportunity to get inputs from business, from civil society and from other experts, rather than trying to introduce new laws to prove that reform is going ahead. So there's still a lot to do, but direction is definitely in the right way. I think there are a lot of challenges for companies coming in, whether or not you're a large or a small enterprise, around legal uncertainty, this very rapidly changing legal framework, but also just around questions like price. I mean, the price of many assets, particularly land, is probably hugely overvalued compared to what you're seeing in the region. And so that's putting off a number of companies from establishing a significant presence in areas like real estate or retail. You're seeing companies who are coming in who are in, for example, oil and gas, where clearly there are assets here to be exploited, or at least to be explored for. And so we're about to see the announcement of a large number of offshore blocks being awarded, probably predominantly to Western companies who haven't been here previously. And then you're seeing some of the large multinationals who recognise that this is a very important market of perhaps 60 million people. So they're putting a sort of first foot in the market, but they're not going to start expanding until prices come down and until certainty becomes more certain. I think that the tax revenue from the extractive industry, and particularly oil and gas, is going to be really important for this country to establish a stronger educational base, do more about support for health. There's not going to be much other forms of income for the coming few years. However, actually the new companies coming in are probably not going to be exploiting and producing and paying taxes for many years to come. So the government's currently very reliant on some of the existing offshore blocks like Total, Petronas, the Thai company PTTEP, Daewoo. Now, the key thing obviously is to make sure that those revenues are used effectively, and what's been a very positive step in the last year is the government committed to joining the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative, which is a way of demonstrating publicly on the part of companies how much tax they're paying, and from the government side how much tax they're receiving. And so that's going to bring a whole new layer of transparency, which up until the last year has not been there at all, and that should help to avert the resource curse. Transparency here is something which the government says it wants, civil society certainly wants, business says it wants. I think there's a backlash against how bad things have been in the past, and so there's probably more appetite here for pursuing responsible business on part of all the different stakeholders than you will find in many other countries in the region, not least because they want to demonstrate that break with the past. So the government has been very committed to joining EITI and making much clearer what its general budget is than it ever did in the past. There's definitely a legacy, though, that they will have to overcome in terms of the way spending in the past was skewed towards the military. And so slowly we're seeing an increase in spending on social services, but there's still an awful long way to go on that. And there's now a very much more active civil society who are speaking out inside the country, pushing the parliament to decide the budget to really start to increase spending on the right things and reduce it on the wrong things. At the same time, there's also much more of a push to get transparency within the private sector and that relationship between government and private sector, and particularly the crony companies, so that state assets and state services which previously were just handed out without any sort of transparency are now being put out to a public transparent tender process. And we saw that recently with the award of the telecoms licenses, which was done in an extremely transparent way. I think there is the opportunity for Burma to avoid some of the mistakes of its neighbours, but the problem is capability within the civil service and also just a lack of systems. The really big challenge here is around land, and there is a lack of paperwork stretching back over decades, which is a reflection of many things, starting from the colonial system, the Second World War, the fact that the country was then, most assets were nationalised, and then we moved to a system where when assets did change hands, people didn't record that transfer because they didn't want to pay tax. So there is probably, I was talking to one of the telecoms companies the other day who was saying that of the various sites that they're looking at, maybe 3% of them can the owners show that they've got a title to the land. Not necessarily because they don't have that title, but just they don't have the paperwork. So all of those sort of challenges are going to be very, very difficult for this country to address. And what's really important is that they can learn from the lessons elsewhere in the region. I think the ethnic diversity is clearly a problem for finding a political solution. You've had ongoing civil wars here since the early 1950s, and many of those issues that started the wars are still not resolved. The ethnic minorities are still demanding a political dialogue on a number of issues around autonomy, recognition of their linguistic rights and so on. And so it's going to mean that a number of those areas which have been either previously in conflict or still in conflict will face big challenges around natural resource exploitation, which is not benefiting the local populations, and sheer humanitarian problems. And we're still seeing that up in Kachin State, where there's an ongoing fighting today. So there are a lot of problems around that ethnic issue, which sitting in Rangoon you don't necessarily see, but we need to remember that this is a state that is the size of France and has a population even larger than that. The general narrative now, both from the government and certainly from the ethnic minorities side, is to embrace federalism, but the question is the definition of what that federalism means. So that's one of the challenges that is part of the current constitutional discussion, and it's the uncertainty around that overall constitutional discussion and what is going to come in the 2015 elections, which is still making a lot of businesses enter a sort of wait-and-see mode rather than coming in and investing. The Myanmar Centre for Responsible Business was established over about a year, but we set up shop about 6 months ago, and we're an initiative funded by a number of European governments, including the Swiss, the Danes, UK, Norway, Netherlands, Ireland. And the aim of the centre is to try and raise standards of responsible business practice within Myanmar, both by helping foreign companies of whatever nationality who are looking to come in and invest, but also to help Myanmar companies to raise their standards of responsible business practice, and particularly the respect for human rights. So we are engaging with those businesses, but also with government to help them understand more about what's required of them as a regulator, and then with civil society so that they can get more of an understanding of what good business practice, responsible business practice is, and how to demand that of the companies who are active here, whether they're local or foreign.